Let me begin by explaining what dotations were, dotations, dotation. They are grants of essentially rents, not land, but an annual income that Napoleon begins to grant to his principal followers, and then more generally to his soldiers, from 1806 on. From the moment when Napoleon begins his cycle of great conquests, he begins rewarding his followers. The first grants were made to his marshals and ministers. They were actually called, I think they were called grands fiefs impériaux. There's no, it's quite clear that these things are supposed to be fiefs. But very quickly, the practice is extended much more broadly, even to common soldiers. By the end of Napoleon's regime, approximately 11,000 dotations have been made. It's a significant number. And as I said, these dotations do not consist in land. They consist in rents, usually on the occupied territories. Their size varies considerably. The largest dotation, for example, Maréchal Berthier's, it's over 1 million francs in annual income. Not bad. But ordinary soldiers get these as well, usually at the 500 franc level. If you want to know more about the dotation, that's all I'm going to say about what they were in reality. You can read an article by Monika Senkowska-Gluck, published in 1970 in the Revue d'Histoire Moderne et Contemporaine, this giant issue that was all completely dedicated to Napoleonic history. If someone has worked on this subsequently, I'd be very interested to know, but I don't think I'm not aware of anything. Okay. Why did the Napoleonic government make these grants? Why did Napoleon issue dotation? It's pretty obvious. It's to reward his soldiers and servitors. To motivate them, to reward them, to attach them to his regime, to his military service. I was interested when I was actually looking at the law creating the dotation. I was interested to read Regnault de Saint-Jean d'Angely make the argument explicitly that dotations were necessary because soldiers in the armée de terre, they didn't get prize money the way naval soldiers did, and it was necessary to reward the glorious soldiers of the imperial army at least as well as the less glorious marins of the Imperial Navy. So these dotations are seen initially as prize money for the land army. But later on, beginning in 1808, they get associated in certain cases with the new nobility that Napoleon is creating. But I'm not going to talk about that here. Let's just put it this way: to have a hereditary noble title under Napoleon, you need a dotation, but you can have a dotation without having a noble title. And the majority of dotations are not attached to titles at all. Okay, where does this curious institution of dotation come from? That's a real question. Clearly, the French Revolution is not the model of this institution, but nor is the Bourbon regime that the Revolution overthrew. The Bourbons have not been really erecting new fiefs. They've been erecting titles, but they haven't actually been distributing new land to anyone. It's not really there. Where does Napoleon get the idea for the dotation? And my argument, of course, is that they're taken from history. They're taken from accounts of the Frankish conquest and the distribution among the Franks of the lands of the Gauls among each other. And actually, this is a very, very widespread historical discourse in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. The discourse on the origin of fiefs, or really the debate on the origin of fiefs. It is a major, major debate in France, particularly among jurists, but later in the 18th century, of course, it gets taken up by political philosophers like Mably and Montesquieu, and it's absolutely critical to all of these people's discussion of what we would call the Constitution Française. They're different ideas. I'm not going to rehearse the whole debate on the origin of fiefs, but essentially, if you say, like Mably, that the Franks got together, the Frankish warriors got together in an assembly of equals to distribute the spoils, you're making a kind of democratic argument. It's actually a way of engaging in a constitutional debate. And if you're a Charles Loiseau, I could say Montesquieu too if you want, who believes that no, actually the Frankish leader, the Frankish king, handed out property to his followers, you're making a monarchist, a kind of absolutist argument about the constitution of the country. So anyway, leaving aside those kinds of disputes, which are political disputes among the early modern French writers, what do these works say? What do these historical works say about the origin of fiefs? They actually have several things in common. Point number one, they all agree that fiefs originate in the distribution of the lands of Gaul to among the Frankish warriors. How the distribution took place, matter of debate, but that there was a distribution, everyone agrees about that. Secondly, everyone agrees that the purpose of these grants at the moment of the Frankish conquest was to support the military service of the Frankish warriors, to allow them to continue to be soldiers and to serve their king. The third thing they all agree on is that the original fiefs of the Frankish conquest did not convey public power. They did not convey what was termed puissance publique. They don't involve rights of justice. They involve no power over people. Instead, it's simply land. Fourth point that all the authors agree on, these fiefs, these Frankish fiefs, originally were not hereditary. They were not hereditary property. They couldn't be transmitted. They were made originally only for the active military life of the warrior who got a particular grant. The moment that Frankish warrior ceased his military service, his grant went back into the common pool, into I guess it would be the royal domain, to get redistributed to another warrior. But all of and this is the important point, all of the works on the origin of fiefs in the early modern period really focus in on the process by which they evolve from temporary military grants, bénéfices militaires, into fully hereditary property, into how they basically become what French people in, say, the 16th, 17th, or 18th century would recognize as a fief. And this evolution, there's a great deal of agreement among the different authors about the process. Originally, the fiefs are made for the duration of military service. Second, then they later become lifetime grants. The warrior gets to keep it after his retirement. Then, as the warriors profit from the growing weakness of the Frankish kings, these grants become transmissible to their sons. Then they become vendable, saleable, objects of commerce. And finally, the point at which these primitive fiefs become property, real property, is the moment when they become transmissible to women. That is the birth of modern property in France, according to the writers of the 16th through the 18th century. When women who are considered inapt to perform military service are able to inherit and own fiefs, that's the revolution that creates early modern, or whatever, the monarchical France. That's the point of transition out of the Frankish period to the France that people know. By the way, that word revolution applied to the moment when fiefs become fully hereditary, that's from the works themselves. In fact, each one of these stages is described as a revolution. Okay, so there's a process by which the fiefs become hereditary that's recounted in all of these works of history. There's another tendency which is for public power, puissance publique, to get attached to the fiefs and to become hereditary along with the fiefs. And obviously that process by which fief the land and public puissance publique get assimilated together and become hereditary patrimonial property, that is the birth of what the early modern jurists called the seigneurie en concreto, or the seigneurie that you read about in the history books. And they're very concerned with how that happens. Fortunately for us, we do not have to talk anymore about puissance publique, because Napoleon's dotation, Napoleon's fiefs, never include any form of puissance publique. They never involve any kind of justice or public authority at all. So we'll leave that aside. However, Napoleon's dotations undergo exactly the same kind of evolution toward full heredity that the Frankish fiefs in the history books that Napoleon read undergo. It's a strikingly similar evolution. Initially, when Napoleon's dotations are created, they are transmissible through primogeniture to the eldest son, from the son of a donataire, from a donataire to his son. If that donataire has no sons, no offspring, they revert to the crown. They're réversibles to the imperial domain. Napoleon can also withdraw a dotation if the son fails to perform military service, if the son is a slacker or worse. Okay, so in the original conception of the Napoleonic dotation, you really have something modeled very closely, I think, on the bénéfices militaires of the Franks, of the original good bénéfices militaires that are distributed right after the Frankish conquest. But very rapidly, a whole series of laws are going to be passed that modify these initial conditions of reversibility and primogeniture and so on and so forth, and come very close to turning the dotation into full-blown private property. Let's see, what are they? Just to name some of them, substitution in hereditary transmission, that is allowed. Transmission to collateral family lines, even in the female line, in the mother's line, that is allowed. Later on, adopted sons are allowed to inherit the dotation, then widows of the donataire, and finally, this is the clincher in 1812, the daughters of donataire are allowed to inherit their father's dotation. But there's a condition. A daughter who inherits a dotation has to, by the age of 30, she has to marry a wounded veteran of the imperial armies to preserve a semblance of to keep sort of close to the purpose of these things. So it's not a total evolution toward private property. On the other hand, this evolution takes place over the course of about 5 or 6 years, whereas the evolution of the Frankish benefice, as recounted in the history books, takes centuries. So Napoleon's evolution is very rapid toward a kind of hereditary property status for these dotations. I should say, and I'm getting close to my conclusion, and I think I haven't gone over the time, political commentators, especially hostile ones, point out this striking parallel. People are conscious of the parallel. So let me quote from one hostile legislator who is talking about, who's denouncing these dotations during the Restoration. And unfortunately, I've pulled it from a book manuscript, so it's in English. I don't have the original French, but in my translation is that this legislator, he says, in just 6 years, Napoleon's system of feudalism, which first instituted heredity of fiefs only in favor of the princes of his blood, ended up by establishing the same privilege for the daughters of soldiers, denouncing the institution. The point is not really to denounce it here. The point is to point out that there's a real parallel between what Napoleon undoubtedly read about the history of the Frankish conquest in early France and how fiefs originated then with the dotation that he sets up as a kind of framework for his empire. Now, that's my conclusion, that's my argument. I do have a postscript, however, that concerns the fate of these dotations. And there are really two interesting moments. One takes place in 1810. In 1810, there's a law passed, very obscure law. Not much has been made of it by historians, but it is a law that requires donataires who have dotation in occupied territories in places like Poland or Germany to liquidate their dotation, to sell it off, and to take the profits from selling off their dotation and reinvest them in France. Had this law been fully carried out, obviously it's passed only in 1810, it doesn't have time to get carried out, but had it been fully carried out, this would have represented a complete withdrawal of empire back within the boundaries of 1810 France, which are already pretty expansive, but nonetheless it's a kind of pulling back. Maybe it represents a desire that Napoleon had to find an exit strategy, to end the constant wars and to circle the wagons and to come up with a way for Europe to live in peace. Obviously it didn't happen, but some of it happened. Some of the dotations were converted into French lands and various kinds of French rents in metropolitan France. In fact, when Napoleon finally is overthrown, there are 2 million francs in annual revenue of dotation that have actually been transferred into France. So there is a kind of residue of this imperial policy that the Restoration has to deal with. What is the Restoration going to do with the ex-Napoleonic donataires and their 2 million francs in annual revenue? The donataires, now there are only 3,600 of them, many of them died in the course of the wars. The donataires want to keep their dotation. They consider the dotation property. But there are others who believe they have a better claim to this residue, particularly Vendéens, returned émigrés, etc., who claim the 2 million francs in revenue. This is a political hot potato. There is a long, long struggle in the Restoration over the residue of this that pits the survivors of the Napoleonic regime, the hardcore donataires, against the émigrés and the Vendéens. And it's really, it's one, I don't know if it's, I'm not a Restoration expert, but it seems like one of the more important debates in the early Restoration. It continues until 1821. But that is a whole other story, not one that I will share here.